Welcome to the TTT News Special. I'm DK Rosner. And while July 27 is the anniversary of the attempted coup in 1990, I hope to address the issue of healing from deep-seated or repressed trauma on a wider level. And for that, we are joined by two members of the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists, Secretary Deborah Lee Riviera and President Wendy Jeremie. Welcome, ladies. Thank you so much for being a part of it. And I want to start off with you, please, Madam President. Define trauma.
Good afternoon, DK. Thank you for having us, Deborah and myself.
So how do you define trauma, Ms. Wendy?
I didn't hear what you just said, DK.
Define
I said thank you very much for having us.
We're looking at a definition, so we're looking to define trauma.
Well, at this very moment, I told Deborah before, I'm traumatized. The West Indies are 66 for 4. Too much is happening, too soon and too fast to be processed. I can't understand it. But trauma is an experience that affects an individual, happens in an individual's life that can cause them serious harm, whether it is mental, physical, or emotional. And this can be very disturbing to them because at the moment of the trauma, they're out of control. And it can leave them in a state of shock, denial. They can distance themselves from others. They become sad and hopeless. They feel disconnected, numb, all of those things, sad, hopeless, confused. They don't want to do things that they used to do before. Guilty, shame. They can blame themselves as well. And having said that, if they do not seek professional help in a timely manner, it can lead to post-traumatic stress disorder. And we can suffer from trauma, from losing a loved one, witnessing an act of violence, living with a parent or a partner who may be misusing substances, or where there's serious injury or illness. All of those things can cause trauma in our lives. And all of us experience some kind of trauma, whether it is a big, which we'll call a big T, or small t. You could break your arm, but you could be sexually abused as well. So we have different kinds of trauma that we experience in our lives. And we must seek help, give ourselves time to come to terms with what has happened. And sometimes a friend might tell us, you're not behaving well, you're not acting right. We have to seek professional help, give our time to process what has happened. And that's how we sort of deal with trauma at the beginning, That's what trauma is in our lives. It's presented to us in many ways.
And there's an issue of time that I'll want to come back to and speak to you about. But before that, let me bring Deborah into the conversation. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And Deborah, we just heard about big T, small t from Wendy. What are some of those factors affecting the degree of trauma? What are some of those things that go in? Because Wendy would have spoken about being things like emotions, feeling a lack of control. But what are some of those factors that are bear down to affecting the degree of trauma that an individual or person may feel?
Okay, some of those factors would depend on a person's beliefs, their perceptions, their level of coping, their resiliency, the amount of support they have, the social support. Wendy mentioned the psychological functioning before the traumatic event, because we must remember, before the traumatic event occurs, a person was living their life and they might have been traumatized by something previously. So when this happens now, it triggers the past event. In addition to that, you have to look at the stressors. We are all faced by different stressors that can really impact on a person's ability to heal. They are meaningful relationships. Meaningful relationships would involve support once again. You can have someone you can depend on, someone you can speak to, so you're not alone. And prior trauma history, of course, because as I said earlier, many times people are re-traumatized. They're affected by trauma earlier, something happens again, it triggers they go right back. It was never dealt with before. And because it was never dealt with before, it has a much more detrimental impact or effect on this person. You know, I just want to read, there's a quote from Peter Levine, an author, and he said, trauma is a fact of life. It does not have to be a life sentence. That speaks clearly to what Wendy stated, that prisons need assistance in dealing with trauma. It's not something many times that you can deal with on your own because you're unable to see clearly. So you may need to seek some type of therapeutic assistance from a professional.
And both of you all would have spoken about seeking assistance from a professional. But even before we get to that professional though, what are some of the things that you would suggest that individuals who may not be professional but have to interact with a person who is suffering from some sort of trauma to engage, to deal with them? Because, and two, I don't know if they're polar opposites, but two positions could be empathy in terms of, I may not know exactly what you're feeling, but at the same time, I know it had to feel some sort of way, versus that stressing you, that traumatized you, get over that, man.
Right.
So
yes, get over it. Yeah.
Well, let me just say, sometimes we have to ask ourselves, is this trauma real? Is it real? We have to understand it ourselves, the impact it has on us, so that we do not minimize it. Because if we minimize it, we're not going to deal with it. Sometimes we say, well, so long that happened to me so many years ago, but yet we haven't dealt with it. And we might be ashamed to say how we live, you know? And that causes us not to really get deep into it, because we have to come deep into it. It's simply, you know, we have to bring it up. We have to face it for what it is and deal with it. And then even how do we deal with it if we get deep into it? We have to take time out for ourselves, talk about it to ourselves. And before that, we might want to simply write it down, see what sort of patterns are shaping from that. And then after that, we might want, as I say, seek a therapist who might be able to throw some light on it. I mean, a friend too, but the therapist is more professional doing it. And then after that, we talk about it to ourselves. We talk aloud about it to ourselves. And then we may find a solution to it. I don't know what Deborah thinks about that.
Yes,
you might, want to
agree.
Add.
So DK, before you see the therapist, if you're looking at before, just as Wendy would have stated, you have to understand what the trauma means, you know, because some people don't see certain things as trauma. They see these things as, oh, that happened to me. What does this trauma mean? How it has impacted you, how it has impacted your physical life, your emotional life, your spiritual life, all aspects of your life. How did it occur? You have to accept that it has occurred, and now you need to move on from it. But moving on is not a simple process. You will have to come to terms with it. So you'll have to come to terms then with your feelings. If you're talking with someone, if it's someone, a friend, you know, somebody who's very concerned about you, they will need to be able to listen to you. Listening without judgment, listening, just listening, attentive listening, whereby, you know, you're encouraging the person to speak, you're encouraging the person to share. As Wendy said, they can write it. Some people feel more comfortable writing because they feel a little more embarrassed when they have to speak. So writing is also a good idea. You have to know that, you know, your emotions that you're feeling, it's okay to feel those emotions. It's okay to feel those emotions, negative emotions as well. And then you must accept your limitations, because even though you may be doing this on your own or with a friend, you will be limited in how much you can do, how much you can accomplish. So you may reach to a certain point. Sometimes people read self-help books, and some self-help books sometimes do help some persons, you know, because they are able to go that path, but you may have some limitations. And when you recognize those limitations, you may need to seek assistance outside, external assistance. You don't hesitate to ask for support if you need it.
And I just want to say that
I cannot afford to accept these limitations. And I say that if I can't accept these limitations, because to accept these limitations, to feel this feeling, to realize that I need some time to deal, to heal, that's not going to allow me to function in the way that I can. I have these, I'm the breadwinner, I have these responsibilities. How do I deal? But I asked that question of you, Deborah, when we return from this break. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are speaking about trauma with members of the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists. The question that I asked, because Wendy and Deborah, you all both spoke about time and time-based responses and making sure that you have time. But if you don't have the time, because these responsibilities that you see, taking the time to deal with that trauma is going to make you liable to not be able to function in this way. What do you say to that person?
DK, just let me say this. You see, the person has to understand that the event has to be transformed. Otherwise, the immediacy, the closeness of it is going to still be there as if it only happened yesterday. Yeah. So when I say transformed, I mean it has to be sort of digested. It has to be integrated into one's functioning every day. And how one does that is one must not be afraid of facing it, of giving it some thought, of avoiding it, because when we're traumatized, we avoid it. We get numb. We get numb to certain things. So if we can deal with the memory, let it become a part of our everyday living and everyday memory and integrate it, then we can say the trauma is integrated and we don't put it aside. So that if we allow ourselves that, then we can say, well, we could start to resume living as we lived before the trauma occurred. So the event has to be transformed, integrated, digested into our lives. And that's how we deal with it. We try to make it become a part of us, part of the memory, not being afraid of it. Because if we avoid it, we can't get over it. So we have to face it.
No, you're saying that, and I'm thinking of two things. One, a sand grain turning into a pearl inside of an oyster. I'm also thinking about something like Alcoholics Anonymous, where you need to be able to say, okay, this is my position, and articulate it, and having it articulated and held up to the spotlight, you can move forward. So in terms of like, this is my problem, this is my situation, this is what I'm dealing with. And even the way that you say constantly dealing with it, so as opposed to saying, well, I don't drink rum again. It's saying I'm so many days sober. So is that there's an ongoing journey that you you engage with on a daily basis?
Yes.
Is that something you agree with, Deborah?
It is. You see, we have to remember there are many persons who are walking around with trauma. It's not something that you always see. So they cope. They cope pretty okay. They work, they eat, they live, they take care of their families. But if it is that you really want to start looking at it and getting healthy, you have to understand that trauma disconnects a person from themselves. There's a certain disconnect whereby a certain part of your life it's just not there. It doesn't exist. So in order to really heal from it, some type of reconnection has to take place. Reconnection with the body, reconnection with the mind, reconnection with, your God or your spirituality, your loved ones.
And with people, with others.
And with others, and with yourself, most importantly. Yes. Because many times people, they don't even connect with themselves. They see themselves outside of themselves. And that in itself is a traumatic response.
Yes, that's true.
How does that continue or carry over though? Because some people talk about generational curses. Is trauma something that can be passed from generation to generation in your view, Deborah?
Of course. There are different types of trauma. One such is generational, intergenerational trauma. You have collective trauma. You have different types of vicarious trauma. Now, with generational trauma, we see that a lot, intergenerational trauma. It occurs where, due to what? Poverty, could be due to people being incarcerated, community violence, or abuse that goes on in families. So this unsolved trauma that takes place. It might be endured by mothers. It comes from trauma experienced by parents and grandparents, further descendants, and it's just handed down, sometimes knowingly, sometimes unknowingly. How do they hand it down? They hand it down through feelings, they hand it down through memories, they hand it down even through language. So therefore you have generations just being affected by a similar event that's taking place at different times in their lives.
And this reminds me of the saying, until the lesson is learned, it will be taught. But with that in mind, though, Wendy, upon who does the responsibility of dealing with trauma lie? Because sometimes we may look at that pearl and forget that in the middle of that pearl, the heart of that pearl, is a sand grain that started the whole thing moving. So is it individual? Is it a collective responsibility? How do we share that responsibility?
I think it's two-sided. The individual has to know how to deal with it because trauma is an individual experience. We all handle trauma in a different way. So Deborah might look at something, I may not, right? Yeah. I may be resilient, she may not be as resilient. So I have my part to do. Also, it's also, and I think it could be the larger, the collective, a policy. For example, this may be looked at under 3 headings. The preventative way, whereby policies for like caregivers, family members, things like quarantining and social distancing may be instituted. Secondly, the informed perspective, raising awareness about trauma in schools, across all the perspectives, the health sector, the residential homes, NGOs, clinics where pregnant mothers attend, communities, and training can take place for staff as well to pass that awareness on to who attend the clinics and so on. Groups. And then finally, it must be trauma specific, meaning people must have access to interventions and services that mitigate the impact of trauma. For example, what about our protective services? They need therapy too. What about in some of the sensitive areas in which they work? They all need trauma. They all need therapy for the trauma they experience.
And with regard to that kind of intervention, though, Wendy, we have about 2 minutes more. I want to leave the last words with Deborah, but I want to ask you, does trying to have those sort of interventions, how does that change during a period like this in the pandemic?
Well, it has to be done like under the holistic way, a healing-centered approach, I think, and this views trauma as something that is culturally bound, spiritually bound, holistic, a lot of civic action in communities, access to EAP services for all, and that will help it to change in this time where one can access interventions that are there for them. Because remember, we also have our healthcare workers, the frontline workers who need to use it as well. Yeah, they are traumatic. They are affected, with this trauma and with this pandemic, which is traumatic for everybody.
Definitely.
So that's
in addition to that, Wendy, DK, remember everybody now is using virtual platforms.
Yes.
So even though we're not able to meet for this particular point that Wendy's making, people are using Zoom, they're using Microsoft Teams, they're using whatever platform it is. So you can still have a meeting where persons' issues can be discussed and some type of assistance or service can be given to these persons who need it.
Yes.
Wendy Jeremie, Madam President.
I'm not hearing you too well.
But we want to thank you, and we also want to thank you, Deborah Lee Riviera, members of TTAP, the Trinidad and Tobago Association of Psychologists, and on behalf of the entire news team, thank you for taking part of the TTT News Special.